morning to you all, and hope everyone had a great week so far. And a very big thank you to all of you for taking the time to register. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are living. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Rakesh Bandipalli, and I'm the Director for SCLAA Vic and TAS Division. And it's my immense pleasure to welcome you all to one of the most anticipated webinars for this year, which is about the future of supply chain planning. Before I pass it on to a moderator, I would like to quickly mention a couple of things about SCLAA. For those of you who don't know about SCLAA, it is Supply Chain and Logistics Association of Australia, which is the largest network of supply chain professionals in Australia. We run events such as networking nights, thought leaderships, site visits, mentoring programs, and webinars like this. So please follow our LinkedIn page to stay up to date with all the events that we have planned ahead of time. And again, like I said, a huge thank you to all of you for showing your interest for this webinar and the time taken to attend this, which gives us a lot more inspiration to organize a lot more interesting and curate a lot more insightful content like this for future events. Some basic housekeeping rules. Please be advised that this session is recorded. And also, if you do have any Q&A, we do allocate some time in the later half of this webinar, which is around 20 to 25 minutes, depending on how far the questions go. But please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. It should be on the bottom of your screen. Just reiterating in the Q&A box, please don't drop it in the chat box because it's not monitored. So Q&A would be awesome. We'll get back to your questions. All right, so now it's almost time. So I would like to pass it over to Faraz, a little bit about Faraz Vida, who has a PhD in supply chain management with over 10 years of industry experience in the areas of planning, logistics, optimization, and analytics, and strategy development. Faraz has worked for a broad range of industries, including manufacturing, 3PL, retail, wholesale, FMCG, and energy. It is also my great pleasure to work with him alongside in my most recent company, and I know how particular and meticulous he is about a lot of planning and the strategy of supply chain, and he's got a lot of passion for supply chain, as we all do, and hence he's taken the ownership to organize a very insightful webinar on supply chain planning, which is definitely one of the most current and the hot topic. So without any further ado, Faraz, over to you.
All right, thanks, Rakesh. Hi, everyone. Welcome to SCLAA Thought Leadership Webinar on the future of supply chain planning and its importance in business long-term growth. My name is Faraz Bidar. I'm the Vice President of SCLAA Vic TAS Division. It's great that the event had a considerable attraction. You can see, I will introduce the panelists shortly, and after that, we will cover 7 questions for the next 45 minutes. The questions were already published on the webinar flyer, so the audience should be already familiar with them. We also allocate 10 to 15 minutes to answer your question at the end of the webinar. So as Rakesh said, if you have any question during the webinar, please ask your question using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay. Supply chain today are experiencing more disruption than ever. Post-pandemic, businesses faces different challenges, from uncertain business outlook due to inflation and raising costs, lower sales or margin. Still some challenges with supply uncertainty in some sectors, and inventory issues such as excess stock make planning a more important factor for success. Especially in time of disruption, it is critical to make improvement in the supply chain planning process to enhance decision-making and refine processes, organization, metrics, and technology. I'm so honored to have an expert panel here today, and I will introduce the panelists, starting with James Small, who is a principal of Carrigan Consulting. James provides practical hands-on assistance with sales and operation planning and integrated planning processes. He has been implementing S&OP for more than 20 years. He ran his own consulting business, Carrigan, and was previously the managing partner for Oliver White in Asia Pacific for 10 years. So thank you for joining us, James.
Thank you, Faraz.
Next, we have Skalk de Klerk from O9 Solution. Skalk works for O9 Solution as Vice President and Industry Solution for C, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan, and he's based in Singapore. His focus is on establishing O9 Solution within the region and helping O9 clients to solve industry-specific challenges arising from volatile supply chain landscape of recent times, using the latest digital operating model technologies while assuring value realization during technology adoption. So welcome, Skalk. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Faraz. Morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate that.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. George Panas from Melbourne University. After 25 years of senior management experience, George recently transitioned to academia, completing a PhD on sustainable grocery e-commerce supply chains. He now lectures at the University of Melbourne in both undergraduate and postgraduate supply chain management subjects. In his teaching, George draws extensively on his own personal work experience, where he led major transformational supply chain initiatives at Coles Group, Australia Post, and NBN. So good to see you, George, and thank you for joining us today.
Cheers, Faraz. Great to see you again, and welcome everybody.
Thank you. So as you notice from the panelist background, we look at today's topic from different directions. Industry, we have industry practitioner, technology solution, and academia. So hopefully we will have a great discussion. But before I start the webinar question, I would like to start with the definition of supply chain planning. So we all be clear with the webinar concept and scope. So I'll go to the next slide. So supply chain planning is the process of optimizing the delivery of goods, services, and information from supplier to customer, which balances supply and demand. Supply chain planning provides planning, what-if scenario analysis, and real-time demand commitments. So that's a definition I selected from Gartner. So I'm gonna stop on the screen. And I move to the, so let's start with our webinar with this question from James. In today's business climate, what are the critical factors for successful supply chain planning? How can we define that?
I think for us, I'm glad you put up that slide on defining supply chain planning, because it's a rather wide and varied topic. But I still come off of thinking we're in exciting times of technology and everything else, of our ability to supply chain plan is ever improving. But it still comes back to one fundamental thing: is we need to be able to execute the plan. So there's no point in having a supply chain plan, and I often get involved in conversations where people talk about the plan was optimized, but then we only get 80% execution against the optimized plan. It's still a suboptimal outcome. So I think as everybody on this call who's a supply chain practitioner, is our ability to execute the plan is still the critical success factor. We need to actually plan and be able to communicate and deploy that plan and then execute the plan.
Perfect. So the execution part, that's very important. Yeah. Skalk, what about you? What do you think, and how do you define that?
So I absolutely agree with James. Execution is key, and I think realistically it's across people, process, and technology. All of these vectors are important. I mean, technology is evolving and advancing, and quite frankly, what we can do these days is really computationally extensive and complete from an end-to-end perspective. However, I agree. I think we need to look at it from an end-to-end perspective and really understand skill sets, requirements. And I think the other thing to call out is just a vision for planning. What does good look like? How do you define that? What are you trying to solve, whether it's in the longer term strategic horizon, shorter IBP horizon, or in the tactical operational execution horizon? I think really to understand what good looks like. And I think from our perspective as well, two other things to really think about. And this is to bring on board all teams across an organization that's responsible for planning, upstream dealing with the commercial plans, trade promotion plans, demand planning, supply, S&OP, everybody together to really look at a problem holistically from an end-to-end perspective. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is not only to consider a company's internal data sources, all the planning that occurs in Excel, etc., that's key. But I think also to bring on board external data sources relevant to the company's decision-making processes to really enhance that sort of overall experience. So from my perspective, that's how I think about it for us.
All right, perfect. Thanks, James. And especially when you talk about external data sources, that's something I know is a very challenging topic. George, what about you? You are on mute.
From my experience, I think leading on from the previous speakers, from my experience, one of the key aspects of having a successful planning process, in my view, is really the culture of an organization and senior leadership engagement in a planning process, cross-functional senior leadership engagement. So it's not simply a operations department driving a planning process, it's a cross-functional approach with senior leadership buy-in, senior stakeholders involved across a marketing, a sales area are equally as involved as the operations team, and more broadly extended into suppliers and key partners, logistics partners, key supply chain partners, suppliers, etc., as part of that process. So the culture of an organization, senior leadership engagement, participation, promotion of that planning process, and a company-wide approach, to me, is a really critical factor. And also measures that support organization-wide value. So we're not just trying to increase sales, we're trying to focus on overall value for an organization, profitability of the organization, etc. So ensuring there's a clear understanding, a cross-functional approach, I think is a really key success factor for a planning process.
All right, thanks, George. I can definitely relate to that cross-functional working with cross-functional team and the challenges on that. It's not an easy area when you're coming from supply chain and you want to deal with the sales department or finance department or a director levels. It's something, unless you'll be really good at it, it's for newbies in this area would be very challenging, and would be they may need help on that. But James, I want to go back to you, and you mentioned about executions, and this next question is very much related to that. And you coming with a consulting company experience, so you know what companies need in this area, and that's about capability. What capability do companies need to have for successful supply chain planning?
Yeah. Well, hasn't that been the wonderful thing about the pandemic and the COVID, that supply chain has come to the forefront, and most businesses now understand the need for a supply chain. So I think it's an opportunity we shouldn't waste, and therefore the capabilities are going to be really important. You know, I think what age and experience has brought me in this is I used to be fixated with accuracy and thought supply chain planning was about accuracy. I now am fixated by ambiguity, and I think the real capability of all the supply chain people are on this call and the supply chain planners are on this call is your greatest capability is now, your problem solving skills have always had to be there. Your analytical capability always have to be there. I think your greatest challenge and the greatest capability of supply chain planners now is their ability to present complex information in a way that's easily understood, that people easily understand what the impact is of that information and therefore the decisions that have to be made. That is the greatest skill that supply chain planners now need. And I think that, and COVID really brought that to the fore. And if I could share one other thing, one of the things that I ask supply chain planning teams that we work with is, a supply chain planner, the answer can never be no. Your answer is always yes, with the implications of saying yes. I do not allow supply chain planners are not allowed to say no. We're in the business of making customers happy with availability of product. We're in the business of making profit. We actually have to find the ways yes, but then let the business understand what are the implications of saying yes. And that's where I think that's the ability to manage complex information sources and therefore communicate a message is key for supply chain planners in the modern world. Makes
sense, and that's kind of can be also linked to the finance side of the thing.
Oh, yes.
As well. So now, thanks, James. It's great to mention about the accuracy, which can be also related to the data side of the things, and also the people factor. Scott, what's your opinion on that?
So I think simplistically from my side, it's sort of two main themes or two main areas to look into. I think first of all, connectivity. And what I mean by connectivity is really, horizontal integration, and that could be anything from connecting demand to supply or supply to your supplier collaboration type capabilities, what's happening in the broader landscape, and the retail side of things. It can be connecting assortment and merchandising plans to demand plans, etc. It's really about connecting various teams and data sets together to form that holistic view, right? So that's one type of integration. I think the next one is sort of vertical integration, and that's the integration across time horizons that span the sort of short-term executional type work with a longer-term S&OP type opportunity, and then a longer strategic view as well. I think that's the second type of integration. And then just from a technological perspective as well, I think realistically what we've seen in COVID is response times really need to be far more agile, far more responsive, really looking at what is happening in the network now to address challenges. And I think key for us to understand is technological integration across all of the various teams, data sources, etc., is really needed to, in essence, be able to respond as quickly and as agile as required. Now, that's sort of the connectivity theme. And then secondly, an intelligence theme, right? So it's the 4 whys of decision making. So what happened? Why did it happen? What should we do about it? And what actions can we take? Really to understand practically how can we make those decisions, as James have called out, and really figure out what are the trade-off decisions. That, of course, ties into scenario planning, dealing with the volatility that we've all seen, and continuously monitoring execution against the larger or longer-term plans that we've made, so to keep those things in sync. And I think lastly, of course, is that toolbox of AI, ML, and capabilities, whether it's on the demand forecasting side of things, whether it's looking at capabilities on the supply side, picking up changes in lead times or inventory levels dynamically that's required. And of course, dependent upon the problem that you're trying to solve, using linear programming or heuristics capabilities, dependent upon the sort of objective that you're trying to maximize for. So I think from my perspective, it's really understanding connectivity and intelligence and bringing that on board across the organization. And just to add to what George said earlier, no planning transformation is successful without executive sponsorship and drive and vision. And I think once you've enabled this and sort of set the teams up for success, I think the sky's the limit.
Perfect. And I like when you mention about connectivity in terms of capability. It's reminding me of like when I was doing my PhD, there was a famous definitions about supply chain and statement that nowadays the competition is not between companies versus another company, it's actually between supply chain versus another supply chain. And when you are talking about capability, you are not just saying it's about what is internal capability, you are referring it in a more broader scope, and that's about how you deal with your upstream and downstream supply chain players. Great. Perfect. And Josh, anything from your
look, In terms of capabilities, I'll probably extend some of the comments James made there. I think if I think of a really successful supply chain planner, in my view, or people I've worked with who have been really great at performing this task, it's that intersection between technical skills and communication skills. So how can I not just be good technically, but it's no point being great technically if you can't get a message across, if you can't work with other functions and other teams. It's that real intersect of I can analyze data, I can understand data and gain insights, but I can also work with different functions. I can negotiate, I can collaborate. I have strong commercial acumen. That's another really strong capability that we like to see in this area. Having a real strong commercial sense of what some of our decisions, what impact a lot of our decisions are having. So it's really that intersection between some strong technical skills, but also the ability to think commercially, to work with other teams, to collaborate with others, that I think are really strong capabilities we see in a strong supply chain planner. Beyond that, for an organization, we spoke earlier about process overall, about technology. There's a range of capabilities organizations need, but in terms of the individual, the planner, I think that real mix of tech and softer sort of communication skills are really important capabilities to build as a supply chain planner.
Makes sense. Yeah. So definitely having a person with the right background, so can be able to do all those things, is very important. All right, now let's move to the next question. Again, I'm going to start with James, and that's about S&OP methodology. Is this S&OP methodology still the best approach? What I mean is it fit the purpose for supply chain planning, or something else is available? Because I hear on the internet about S&OP getting old-fashioned. Like, is that true?
Oh, have you got a 5-second delay on this recording? I might sound like an angry old man here. We are in the age of the self-appointed thought leaders, and I see all this traffic coming through. S&OP's dead. But then I think if you go back to the first slide and go, supply chain planning is about demand supply balancing. S&OP is a monthly process within that. I think that demand supply balancing is alive and well, is going to continue. You know, S&OP as a monthly process is going to continue to evolve, and it has evolved over the last 20 years, and it will continue to evolve. So let's not get caught up in the terminology of S&OP versus IBP versus any other 3-letter acronyms of. It's been interesting in the last 7 years, Carrigan, we have not done one project where we haven't implemented a daily cycle, a weekly cycle, and a monthly cycle. Call those, you can call the weekly cycle weekly SOE, you can go with ITP. I didn't think it needed to be renamed. It's a weekly cycle that helps demand supply balancing. So I think, again, to reinforce the point of, we need to get to timely and effective decision making, and that means that every company is going to need a daily cycle, a weekly cycle, and a monthly cycle to deal with the urgency. And I suppose when I read some of that traffic that comes across your desk on it's the timely of decision making is really where I start to focus on. I've got one customer at the moment that they think they're going to run out of their 3PL space in June 25 based on their growth. I don't need to have a meeting with the MD and the sales director by 5 o'clock this afternoon to make a decision about a 3PL in June 25. That is the decision they're making that happens through a monthly cycle. So I think we just need to start to think about the decisions, the context, and the urgency of which decisions need to be made, and that'll lead you back to a daily, weekly, and monthly cycle. So I think monthly planning is likely to continue.
All right, regardless of the name. Scott, your opinion on that? Are there anything else now that company should focus on? What was your opinion and so on what James mentioned?
So I completely agree with James. It's critical to have a monthly, weekly, and daily cycle and integrate them across. No disagreement there. I think just from the more longer term strategic perspective, I think we are seeing demand and supply balancing and matching still being the heart of it and the core of it. But I think we are seeing, bringing on board commercial simulations, looking at trade promotional plans, the implications across demand forecasts, of course, the supply response and the trade-offs, etc. Right? So we're seeing that come in, and of course, we're seeing the sort of volume to value translation where we take the demand forecast and the volumes, turning that into the financial projections and understanding the implications thereof. So I think the core of the process that James outlined stands. It's a case of using technology to augment that, bringing more data sources, more teams on board, really connecting all of this together and being able to make those decisions, whether daily, weekly, monthly, with the right teams, the right stakeholder sets and the right scenario trade-offs, looking at cost to serve, margins, service levels, whatever it might be. And in the future, I would expect it to include carbon as well as part of that sort of trade-off decisions, and really bringing that on board to the executive team, right? But the process and the cadence and the cyclical nature of the process should stand.
Perfect. Cool. The next question, I want to start with Skalk, and that's about role of technology in the future supply chain planning. Especially we now hear a lot about AI and machine learning and other advanced technology. What is the role of technology in the future supply chain planning?
Look, I think at the end of the day, from an 09 perspective, our main thesis is really to bring on board all teams in the decision-making process and to, in essence, create a digital representation of a company's supply chain, looking at the physical network, the sort of plans, whether it's demand forecasts, financial plans, etc., and then the data that's relevant to a company externally. Now, to connect that up until tier 2, tier 3, right down to your end consumption points, whether it's omni-channel, DCs, whatever it might be in your particular environment, and really form a contextual layer to understand the overall status of the network from both a master data and transactional data perspective, to understand where we are today and to use that sort of base case capability to answer all of the questions as we've posed here, whether it's in a daily, weekly, or monthly type process. I think that visibility layer is sort of the first key thing, and I mean, visibility has been a key recurring concept from everybody over the last couple of years. I think on top of that, you need to layer your analytical capabilities, and that's where your AI, ML type capabilities come in. Now, whether that's in the demand forecasting space or in assortment planning, or even in the supply side of things, now we're seeing quite interesting use cases to look at, lead time predictions and dynamic updates across inventory levels and so forth. That's sort of the typical capabilities that we would expect. And then, of course, to bring on board the optimization capabilities that's required for, the company in play, whether it's looking at optimizing, the allocations of parts in an electronic subassembly, or if you're dealing with, for example, a meat processing supply chain, to understand these type of trade-offs and a push-pull dynamic environment as well. So I think all of the analytical capabilities are key. And then, of course, to run your planning workflows, whether it's demand, supply, S&OP, etc., on top of that. But I think realistically, the big challenge that we see is in most companies that we speak with, whether it's multinationals, smaller companies, etc., planning occurs usually in Excel. It's usually in functional teams, and to get collaboration across and really to form, let's say, a knowledge construct in terms of a company's actual view on the environment today is really challenging. So unless you can bridge that gap to have everybody look at, in essence, a knowledge model of the organization, and then subsequently to that, use the new generative AI type capabilities to answer more advanced questions and do it a bit faster than that you can today using the sort of more sequential type flows and capabilities that we have. I think that's where things are going to evolve to in time. So it's an exciting time for us as well. We are actively reviewing the capabilities from a generative AI perspective. What does that mean to us? How do we leverage the technology we've built to, in essence, augment that? But it's really a case of using an enterprise's data to, in essence, enable these capabilities going forward. So that's just a little bit about where we think of things currently.
Perfect. Yeah, and that Excel thing, I don't think that's anytime soon going to go away. But I like the way you again mentioned visibility in the context of the broader of the just not own company. When you think about technology, the future of supply chain planning, you need to have looking at more than just your own company and with your key partner, how you can basically create that visibility. James, I'd like to know your opinion on that, and also from another angle, because you with this supply chain planning solution and role of technology, I want to know the barriers that you see for adopting that as well.
Yeah, like again, I think technology's got a very big part to play. There's a couple of conversations that I have with exec teams, and one that I specifically have with a supply chain director of. There's a metric I wish every business had, which is what's our supply planning cost per unit, whether your units are tons, kilos, doses, or whatever. Because technology has to make us scalable. Technology is going to actually have to help us actually lower our supply chain planning cost. So therefore, rather than, again, like what I said before, rather than thinking of accuracy, we actually have conversations with companies about how are we going to make technology make us more efficient. So if there's any of my customers on this call, they'll probably not again, James, but like one of the things that I talk about is rather than statistical forecasting, people talk about statistical forecasting about making us more accurate. I'm not actually completely bought into that argument, but what I do think statistical forecasting is actually get us to the wrong number faster. So rather than tying up a lot of human people in forecasting a lot of products that really, the last 5%, 10% of our actual volume, I actually think that's the real use for statistical forecasting. It gets me to the wrong number faster. So to me, it's about the scalability, it's about efficiency. And again, one of the things we talk to exec teams about is with supply chain planning, you would like to actually make 70% of your business passive income. I would actually like to be able to sell product, manufacture product, distribute product with the least amount of touch. So therefore, it could start with a statistical forecasting. My planning system plans it. I've got adequate safety stock. I replenish it. I sell it. I make money with little or no touch. So that's where I really think we need to get if you like, the paradigm of how we actually use technology to be efficiency first, to get scalability, and then we get accuracy.
Perfect. I'm just learning new KPIs, the cost of supply chain planning.
Not many supply chain planning teams like that, but it's a really, because again, one of the things I see is, demand planners become senior demand planners, supply chain planners become senior supply chain planners. If they're not actually looking after a wider portfolio and actually got that efficiency, then your supply planning cost per unit is going up.
Makes sense. Great. And George, is the role of technology has changed in this area from what you've seen in the research and academic world?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it's becoming, I think when we spoke about the last question, we looked at, the process is still there, but the role of technology has evolved over the past few decades, if you like. I think even my career, my specialty in my career in industry was around optimization, supply chain optimization, more for longer term planning. The problem you can solve in an optimization model today compared to what you could do 20 years ago in a lot of systems is just enormously more complex. So I think it is evolving. The data that is available to us, the tasks or the analytics we can perform have enormously changed over the past couple of decades. The best example I can give is if you look at historically, an S&OP process may have involved pretty much data that's within my organization. What's in my ERP system, what's in my WMS, what's in my MRP, and Excel spreadsheets, as we've heard, and we would use that data to make some decisions. More and more, we're seeing technology allowing us to extend, either to integrate to partners or to even use unstructured data to start analyzing potentially what's happening upstream in our supplies, as one example. So more and more technology is enabling us to use a greater array of data and to perform analysis on data that's not necessarily sitting in my core systems in my own organization. So a greater diverse range of data, more complex algorithms that we can now perform to look for certain patterns, whether it's on the demand side or the ability to supply side, et cetera, et cetera. So it's opened up that. But again, it goes back to that previous question. I think the role of technology just keeps evolving, and it will continue to do so. The key for me is, how do we use the most appropriate methods to get the most value? Because there is an enormous amount of data out there. You can analyze things until, day and night. How you actually can choose the best use of your supply chain planner's time is really one of the key challenges that I think a lot of organizations face. Where do I invest most in my my efforts in technology? Where is my organization going to get the most value? And I think that's really one of the key areas that organizations want to focus on in their use of technologies.
All right, perfect. The next question also is technology related, but it's more specific, and that's from moving from business insight to decision intelligence. I'm going to start with Skalk first. There is a trend moving from business intelligence, BI, to new approaches of piloting AI tools and automation to generate decisions. Basically, the adding value here is, from what I understand, is the human element be less firefighting, more focused on strategic planning. I would like to know your opinion on this.
So for us, I would agree with that. And I think the way that we think about it, particularly if you look at it sort of in the short-term planning context, S&OP or whatever your chosen methodology is, it's really about firstly sensing disruptions, right? What is occurring both internally and externally that's deviating from the plan, right? So picking up all of the various relevant signals in a short time horizon and then really bringing that on board to an analytical engine to understand what that means, right? So firstly, to sense it. Then secondly, to translate it, right? There are thousands of signals out there, as George pointed out, really to understand what is relevant for my network today and what do we really need to focus on. There'll be cases where, there's a surge in sales for sake of argument, but if there's sufficient inventory in the network, really there shouldn't be a case for planners to get involved, sort of thing. Or it can be a contrary scenario where there's a spike in forecast and sales and we didn't predict it. Now we have to respond very quickly, looking at the options that we have in the network. Now, the need to figure out which ones of these are key that we actually need to look upon, right? Then after that, I would really call out just solving the problem, okay? Using both predictive and prescriptive methods to understand what can we do about it, what are the trade-offs involved, who needs to make the decisions, go through a workflow approval step if we need to, for example, approve expedites or overtime or cross shipments or whatever it might be, really to figure out, okay, this is how we're going to solve the problem, right? So to understand what that means, of course, from an executional perspective, bringing everybody on board to make clear that the decision makes sense, it fits into the broader plans, and then to, in essence, push that through to an executional perspective to drive it through TMS systems, ERP systems, etc. And I think the key thing as well, that last layer of the process is to learn, right? To feed back into a system to understand what happened, why did it happen, what should we do next time? Is it a case of planning master data being out of sync with reality? Is it a case of really re-looking at your forecasting algorithms? Is it a case of data being incorrectly mapped in the network? In essence, really to improve cycle over cycle, and that's typically, you would do that sort of in a monthly process view as well. But it's really about bringing all of this on board, and it's not just about the visibility piece, right? That's typically what people focus upon. I mean, speaking to large multinationals with very sophisticated systems, they can integrate 40, 50, 60 data sources together. But the actionability piece, what do we actually do about it, is the key. And really you need a capability set from a technology perspective to enable that. Visibility is step one, but then really to take that through to the next layer into a planning engine, even in the short term, to understand what we do about it. To me, that's the decision intelligence piece, okay?
Makes sense. And when you mentioned about item master data, and then basically in terms of the accuracy of things, I think that's where you, if you can trust that for decision making. James, what's your opinion on that?
I think, you know, we've got a lot to learn from the weapon of mass destruction that is Excel. You know, when you look at a lot of planners and why they love Excel, it comes back to the word trust, because they implicitly know how that Excel was built. They know what data goes into it. They built the old formulas. They hard coded a few things in the way through, but they implicitly trust that model because they know how it was built. And I think that's the conundrum we face with as we get more sophisticated with technology and the use of systems. People actually have to trust the algorithm. Like last year, we have a simple Excel model that we use. You know, so therefore I'm a foot in both camps here. We've got a simple Excel model that I jokingly call the $27 spreadsheet that we use to inventory model with customers. We had a customer last year who implemented one of the inventory optimization modules. We were running the $27 spreadsheet in parallel because the customer was going, the new module says, James, we should have 14 days of 50 stock. What does the spreadsheet say? When we were going, yeah, our spreadsheet thinks 12. Okay, we trust the system. So that, I think, is really that's the human behavior of, we have to learn to trust the systems, which means we have to have a much deeper understanding of how these systems actually work.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's true. And it's kind of the technology in this area is a bit still is in starting point there. So
James, just to your point there, it's the tech vendors' responsibility and our responsibility to make sure that explainability is sort of inbuilt into what we offer our customers, whether it's on the supply planning side of things or on the demand forecasting side of things. So I agree with you. We can't allow black boxes to in essence promulgate through the network. We need very clear explainability component as well, right?
And I'm glad you say that, Shel, because then what I find is without that, then we end up with supply chain planning teams who, what I call is they're just button pressers, is they're just hitting F4. And they're not able to understand how the number came about, which then takes us back to they can't explain the data, they can't explain the answer, and therefore we don't get decisions made. So it's it's a real conundrum. You know, you're back to the people process and tool conundrum again.
All right, thank you. And George, what's your opinion in here?
Yeah, look, I probably just want to pick up on one of the key terms you use there in terms of decision intelligence, and it goes back to, I think, Skork and some of the comments I made earlier. At the end of the day, we need to drive decisions out of the information we are, collecting, analyzing, etc. So the key to me is that focus on whether it's automating or supporting a manual process, but how we actually drive decisions to drive value. Analytics or insights that you're not going to take action on, to me, it's almost a waste of time performing those tasks. How we drive decision making to change something, to take an action. What are we actually going to do with the insights we've gained or the analysis we've done? Potentially how we automate those, and then we can move on to more strategic tasks, I think is really important. But I love that word decision. How we actually drive decisions to add value to an organization, I think is really key. And I think that's the key point, whether it's automated or whether that's just supporting manual processes. The focus needs to be on how we're going to support decision-making in an organization.
Perfect. And I see a trend here from what we discussed about execution, the successful execution, to this integration and alignment with our business strategy and the journey that company need to go to able to do that. Next question. This is about smaller size companies, something that I'm also coming from. So we hear a lot about the importance of supply chain planning and the benefit of that. And here is all about people, process, technology. But smaller size companies, and I know within the participant, we have also some of them there in the resistance. they say, okay, but this can be maybe not my game because I don't have that resources. So I'm going to start with you, James. How a small size companies can prepare themselves for successful supply chain planning that we discussed?
Yeah. So the challenge is a small company is just a big company with fewer transactions. That's so a small company still needs all the functionality. It still needs all the planning capability of a large company. It's just planning smaller volumes. So, but out of there, I think there's also a slight opportunity. So even a small company is going to have to think how it does its supply chain planning and therefore its resourcing. And I think smaller companies therefore get smarter about hybrid roles. They're not big enough to have dedicated demand planners, supply planners, logistics planners, all the various roles. So I think small companies have actually got an advantage to really think through how you might have one head, but that one head may be doing 3 or 4 different supply chain planning roles. But then, as you said, they might not be able to afford technology, but in the early days, they're going to have to start thinking about their structure. I think George said right up front, or Scout said right up front, is you're never going to get to great supply chain planning unless you've got a vision of what good looks like. That vision of what good looks like can still start in a small company. And you start to have to think about your planning structure. You're going to have to think about what your data is going to look like when you grow up. And all those things, and even though you might be doing some and being more discerning about how you use functionality in the near term around Excel or proper planning systems, but you're going to be thinking about getting your data properly structured so that it'll scale, and eventually you can afford the 3rd tier, 2nd tier, and whatever vendors you're going to end up dealing with. But getting that structural piece in place first is a critical element.
Makes sense.
Because again, that's where I go to scalable. It's just as a company grows, we just can't keep adding more and more resource. You actually have to get those embryonic pieces of how you're going to scale need to be thought through and put in place very early.
Yes. So smaller companies should look at their advantage and basically invest on that. Scott, you're coming from the technology perspective. So if smaller companies goes and looking for some software in this area, they might find, okay, some of them are very expensive and unaffordable for them. What is your recommendation?
So I agree with everything that James says. And I think realistically, smaller companies have got the ability to look at agility as sort of a first capability pillar. I mean, there are less scale impediments, if I can call it to put it to you that way. There's less people to bring on board. I think realistically, you can look at agility as sort of a competitive advantage, really get teams, people, processes, technology together and make these decisions, whether monthly or daily, faster and more synchronized manner. I think it's a huge advantage for smaller companies to think about and to enable. I think from a technology perspective, yes, I think that you might find that some solutions are more expensive than others, but I think realistically, my advice to the audience would be to think about a platform construct, really to, in essence, mesh together various pieces of supply planning elements, demand, supply, S&OP, into a platform construct to really look at the net implications across the value chain. And this doesn't necessarily have to be complex. Even with more expensive solutions, you would start with a base capability set and then sort of use a Lego block approach, if I can put it to you that way, to sort of expand upon that as your maturity, data, processes, etc., evolve. I think even executive teams need to look at, a planning process as, I would call it a product, right? And you're going to release new features and capabilities over a period of time. You're not going to go for the North Star in the first couple of months. You want to be able to build progressively. And I think a platform construct allows that easier. And it doesn't have to be 09. There are other vendors out there as well. But I think about that in that sort of a way. But to me, main thing for smaller companies is the agility component.
Agility component. And that platform construct, Scott, is something that people can find about it. What sort of source do you recommend to kind of go through, to know a little more better on that?
I think the Gartner reports would be a good place to start, or just ping me and I'll gladly share.
All right, that's good. And George, I asked this question from different angle for you. Does the university can provide any support in this area for a smaller size company?
Yeah, look, before I touch that, I agree 100% with the other speakers. I think smaller companies do have, it may be hard on the tech side, but they do have strong advantages in their ability to work as a small team across functions, because often across functions may mean it's the same one or two people in that function. So they can see this as a strong advantage in being able to adjust quickly, to adapt, to be agile, to change, compared to a Coles group or a major organization where you've got hundreds, if not thousands of people you're trying to coordinate. Yep. So small organizations can use this as quite an advantage. From a university perspective, I really think, we speak about skills, capabilities. More and more universities are focusing on whether it's short courses or even online. There's lots of courses, even free courses, where a lot of university groups are offering skill sets on the technical components of, planning optimization, for example. So there's certainly things that smaller organizations and anyone for that matter can look at. Particular courses that focus on some data science concepts is one example, where they can upskill some of their own skills to look at how they can better use the data available to them in a small organization without being experts in a particular area. So more and more we're seeing, whether it's online or universities, offering short courses, micro-credentials, etc., to help upskill people in that space of analytics. Makes sense.
All right. And the last question is good. We've been very good with the times. It's very relevant, and I think with the human factor. And I noticed during the webinar you touched on that, and George, just you mentioned also on this. But I think considering the importance of this human factor, it's good to discuss that a little bit with more detail. So this is for. I know there's people who are here who want to be studying this field or change their field to supply chain planning field. So you said definitely there are some courses that universities can provide and to help the supply chain planners. So if you can explain more on that, and also what are the attributes of successful supply chain planners? So as a planner person, how do you define that?
Yeah, look, I'll probably start initially, and we've spoken a little bit about this, but I think COVID has heightened the, I'll use the word importance, or the need to have strong supply chain planners in organizations. I think with COVID, organizations and consumers in particular have realized that to have a whole range of products available in my store, for example, is not as simple as we all thought. So I think that the function, the role has gained in importance over the space of COVID. Similar to both our speakers before, to me, the capability needs to be a well-rounded capability for a supply chain planner. The best planners that have worked for me have that focus on, I understand the tech side enough that I can get a sense of whether the solution is sensible or not. I don't need to be the biggest technology expert, but I need to be able to use technology to have confidence in the solution that the technology is supporting me make a decision. It's not a black box. I have enough knowledge to have confidence in the solutions or the recommendations coming out of a particular technical solution. So the tech side is important. Equally as important, in my view, are those, what I'll call softer skills. How I communicate key insights, how I can work with a group of cross-functional teams to make decisions, to negotiate, to discuss, to land on a particular solution. Commercial acumen, financial acumen between comparing different decisions and scenarios. They are really important skills in my view. It's a well-rounded role as a supply chain planner. Often, in my view, you either get one of those two extremes. You get someone who's great running meetings and communicating with lots of different people, or you get a real techie who's fantastic at crunching numbers. But where you get that person in the middle who is well-rounded, to me, is a real gem. In terms of courses, like I mentioned, lots of universities across Australia are running more and more courses in terms of data science, how we use AI potentially in our decision making. They range from shorter type courses through to online only sort of courses as well. So I think there's a fair bit happening out there to upskill on particular skills. We also, in our sort of undergraduate or postgraduate programs, and I'm sure all universities, also focus on those softer skills as well. How can you get people working well in teams? How can you, we do more and more work that is cross-functional. How do I get supply chain people working with marketing people to solve a problem? They'll come at things from a different perspective. So more and more in education, we're trying to integrate cross-functional students to work and learn from each other and to collaborate as they will have to do in the workplace. So a real mix, a short course, focus on upskilling particular technical skills, but I think we have to not lose sight of those softer skills that are really important. And again, students and anyone can upskill in those areas as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. If all the participants agree and answer some of those. I can see there are 11 questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure I can see 34 also messages on the chat box. I try to go through them as fast as possible. So,
sorry, Faraz, just before you move on to those questions, of because I think for me that the future of supply chain planner role is, just to build on a point that George said, is for me what's critically important for supply chain planners is financial literacy. COVID has opened up a wonderful opportunity if we finally, companies and I think MDs are finally understanding how supply chain actually drive P&Ls and manage balance sheets. We're moving into, with the current economy, we're going to be moving into the age of the balance sheet in the next couple of years. Companies are going to have to get their balance sheets in order. If you're a supply chain planner and you don't understand every hour and every day how you impact your company's P&L or your company's balance sheet, you've got a gap in your knowledge, you've got a gap in your competency. And as a sample of one, my son wants to work in supply chain. I got him to do business banking and finance at uni. He's now in third year, but I think that financial acumen is critical to being a supply chain planner.
Couldn't agree more, James.
And maybe just Scott, anything else to add in, or should we?
I completely agree with the comments, particularly the financial literacy piece. That's absolutely key. I think from our side, the only thing I can add additionally is we're sort of seeing a change in the role and a change of focus, particularly once technology is becoming better to bit. I think we're seeing the sort of emergence of people that look across both demand and supply in parallel, but they look at it in a particular time horizon, right? So the next 6 weeks or the next 3 to 6 months, etc. So really to be able to understand the trade-offs between demand and supply, to understand the margins, really collaborate, work with different teams, because you're going to be conflicting different KPIs for different functional teams at different times, etc. And it's really a case of bringing everybody on board there and being able to have that conversation and to look at the numbers and interpret it, etc. So I think that's the only thing I can add there, but it's really a focus on time horizons, not only a particular capability set like demand and supply. Of course, that's important, but I think we're seeing people come together to operate in sort of time buckets as well, across KPIs, across teams as well. And that the capability set there then again becomes financial literacy, etc. as well. So,
all right, perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I was just checking quickly some of the questions. There is a question says to Skalk and George, but I think it's also So this audience says the question is to Skalkan, in relation to technology's requirement to moving forward, what are your thoughts about the profile of Australian supply chain workforce? I think James also could answer that. Are we ready in general to move from Excel to better tools with AI or ML? Is there lack of training or interest? George, let's go with you first. With the Australian workforce, basically, how do you see the current market?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it's hard to, I don't have any data to sort of compare specifically to international workforces. Maybe Scott may have some a better insight there. But from my perspective, I think it's evolving. I think more and more we are upskilling, developing skills of individuals to work in that space, in that data science space. We're seeing all universities, as far as I can see, have really increased their offerings in that sort of, I'll use the word data science space in general, not just in supply chain, but in many other areas. So I think we are seeing a huge increase in people looking to increase their skills in that space. How that specifically compares to UK, US, I'm not close enough. I don't have any data to sort of say either way.
Makes sense. But maybe that's where Skal can be more helpful on that, because you are based in Singapore and probably you work with a project across different regions and with your colleagues, you know more better on that. How do you see that Australian workforce in this area?
So for us, I think realistically, whether it's Taiwan, Southeast Asia, ANZ, it's a similar conversation. There is a talent crunch. Let's be realistic. I think it's up to companies really to think about how to solve that. My particular thinking about that is, the Gen Zs of the world want to use the latest technology out there and can be a great attractor for them if they come on board to a company that's using the latest technologies out there. So I think that's one angle to it. But I think from an adoption perspective for the sort of planning technologies, et cetera, out there today, I think the only thing I would call out there is, yes, it's not realistic to expect everybody to become data scientists. Not everybody's going to be developing things in R or Python, et cetera. And that is not the expectation of ourselves. It shouldn't be the expectation of management teams, et cetera. I think if you're a demand or supply planner, it's really a case of understanding the basics, having a good supply chain background, and then really being embedded in the platform and technology that you're using, in essence, make those decisions. Now, there's absolutely a role for data scientists to go on board and really tweak things behind the scenes and optimize things beyond what I would expect a demand supply planner to be able to do. But I don't think there's a barricade or a barrier to entry if you haven't worked with these systems before, right? So I think across the board, there's different capability sets, different roles, et cetera, but it's a common conversation across the region, right? It's not new or unique.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So I'll move on to there's a question to James. Says, hi James, why don't you believe in statistical forecasting? Imagine a situation where a planner need a plan 1,000 or 10,000 item across 200 sites. Can Excel still give you a workable, timely solution?
Yeah, well, that's my point is, yes, it can. And therefore, it would get me to the wrong number a lot faster. So therefore, I can actually plan that. And that's where I think is, yes, statistical forecasting it's about efficiency first. I've got another customer, they've got a much smaller product range. They've got about 350 products. 80% of those products have a forecast error of less than 25%.
Yep.
And therefore, I look at them and go, statistical forecasting hasn't got a lot of use for them. I'm still not at the point where a statistical algorithm is going to beat that human intelligence that they've currently got built into their forecasting process. So I think that's where, is if I've got 3,500 items, I'm going to use statistical forecasting, but let's not pretend it's all about accuracy. It's just about it gets me to the wrong number faster and allows me to plan. And therefore, I can plan safety stocks. It allows me to actually plan a lot faster. And where I do it in Excel or a module, doesn't really matter. So that's where I'm sort of leaning towards where George is it's fit for purpose application of these tools.
Yeah, perfect, exactly. The next one, considering that information sharing, say between a manufacturer and a retailer, lead to lower cost overall. I think, Scott, this would be your question for you because you talk about connectivity. Why are companies still not willing to share information?
I mean, there's always the case of what's in it for me and how does it influence my reality, my world, etc. I think if there's a conversation around the intent usage around the data, what it's supposed to be used for, and what are the implications downstream to the provider, I think that's the best and surefire way to do it. I think that's one component of it. The other component of it is really just not to make it cumbersome to share the data and to really enable sharing to occur quite seamlessly, right? So to have various ways to integrate data and share data, etc., is key as well. But I haven't seen that be such a large impediment. However, if you deal with 200 or 300 suppliers upstream, you're obviously not going to start with everybody. You're going to focus on the top 10, top 20, whatever it might be, put a process in place, and then scale that over a period of time to the rest of your supply base. But it's possible to be done.
It's a journey, basically, you're taking with your supply chain partners. The next one is from Justin Bone. Can the supply chain planning be pushed back onto responsibility of the supplier for these small companies? Maybe James, you can go for that. Sounds like a VMI for me, like the VMI type solution.
It can be, you know, as long as you can live with the consequences of that. You know, we've worked with a lot of business models where, you know, companies go back to their core competency. As one business might go, our core competency is marketing and selling, and therefore they're happy to have a third-party supplier do all their inventory management for them. That is fine, as long as you can deal with the working capital consequence of a supplier managing your inventory.
Makes sense. Yeah. I'm just aware of time. I just see whether I can answer another question very quickly. How does the supply chain community align with procurement team to be set up for success in the future? James, maybe that's again you. That's maybe this is something related to government organization with the procurement teams and so on. Like.
It's one of my goals in life before I retire is to understand the difference between procurement and purchasing and which companies use which terminology in which way.
I like that.
And when I will finally understand that, that'll be time to retire. You know, I think you have to get to that separation. If the role of procurement for me is the contractual, they manage suppliers, it's about pricing, supply chain planning to execute against those contracts. And you know, different business models for different things, but that to me is that separation of the role of procurement is much more strategic, and the role of and if those things are set up correctly, then supply chain planning teams can actually execute against those agreements. That's, you know, in the early stages, that is the delineation and the decision making that I like to see in a procurement process.
Makes sense.
That's probably overly simplistic, but you know. I don't like procurement teams meddling in planning, and you know, planning can't actually set up contracts.
Makes sense. Perfect. We are running out of the time, so sorry we can't answer all the questions now. But what I do is I share the questions with our panelists, and I give your names so they can definitely be in touch with you. Definitely want to happy to support. So. Thanks very much to all three panelists, James Small, Scott de Klerk, and George Panis, for attending and sharing your experience with the audience today.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. I'm gonna later on watch this video and learn some new concepts. I should take notes. Thanks everyone for attending. There was much interest in this webinar. I hope the webinar was useful and insightful for you. You can find about upcoming SCLA programs and events in our website calendar. I think SCLA will attend CMAT trade show next week in Sydney. I attended last one in Melbourne and definitely recommend that. Our next webinar is about job growth, employment, application rate, and worker demographic. The webinar will be on 25th of July. So you can find more details on that on the SCLA website. If you are not a member of SCLA, please register to get updated on all the informations and benefits. Thanks again, all the panelists, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye and
Thank
see
you,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.